good afternoon or good morning, everybody. It's only 10 a.m. Thank you for joining us for our Landscape Matters program this month on pruning shrubs and trees. And, you know, we get a lot of questions, especially because of this late freeze, on how do I prune? What do I prune? How much do I prune? And what's the safest way to do it? So, you know, this is a very relevant program because as trees start to think about coming out of the dormancy, some of the best time to prune a lot of our trees is coming to an end, but also just really thinking about the importance of how pruning plays a part in maintaining a lot of the trees and shrubs within our landscapes. So we'll go ahead and jump into the program. But one of the things that I want us to cover as essential questions is what are the best management recommendations for pruning trees and shrubs? And then the second one is what county and city codes do we need to abide by and what resources are available? So by the end of the program today, you should be able to answer these questions relatively comfortably. And you know, we'll jump into those and we'll come back and visit them at the end. But why do we prune trees and shrubs? I love these pictures. There's a page called Crimes Against Horticulture, and these are a couple examples from that page. So, but think about why do we prune trees and shrubs? You know, we can prune them in such ways and hedges and forms and shapes that work well with any type of landscape, but you know, why do we do it? What's the purpose of it? Go ahead and think about that. You know, I think why do we do it? Go ahead and put that into the chat box, thinking, why do we prune trees and shrubs? What's some of the things that you think about? What's the purpose of it? Yeah, some really good answers coming in. So we have like stimulate fuller growth, improve growth and form, for neater appearance, overall tree health, produce better fruit, help with healthy growth, make a healthier plant. Yeah, increase production of blooms fruit, health. Yeah, so you know, some of the big comments that are coming in really comes back to overall plant health. But you know, we need to be careful on how we're pruning our trees and shrubs as well, because you know, by over pruning or pruning improperly, you can create a lot of issues in itself. And some of the common issues that we see throughout the landscape are examples like crape. We call it crape murder, but that's the over pruning of crape myrtles. Hurricane pruning for palm trees. That's a big no-go, but we see that happen a lot within the landscape, and as well as lion tailing. Lion tailing is a little bit more specific, but that's over pruning the internal canopy of trees. And a lot of times when we're doing these excessive prunings, what ends up happening is those trees actually lose their resistance to or resilience to wind, and can actually make them more susceptible to damage. So some of those benefits of pruning, you know, that you mentioned is, you know, we can use it to reduce size. It can improve the shape and appearance of a shrub or a tree. It can increase flowering or fruiting, improve the structural integrity of trees. That's the big one. And we use it for removing dead or damaged or even sick growth. And we can do pruning to help rejuvenate shrubs. And I'd also like to welcome Thad Crow, just stepped in. He's with Nassau County. Welcome, Thad. And I know that when we have questions and answers about county code and policy, having you both here is going to be really nice. So
thank you, sir. Appreciate that.
So let's talk about, so we talked about what those benefits of pruning are, you know, reduce size, improve shape and appearance, increase flowering, fruiting. So it's really great. A lot of you mentioned these things, you know, it really comes back to tree health or shrub health ultimately. But there are some other benefits like wildlife habitat. How do we make sure that we're maintaining a healthy wildlife habitat, biodiversity? Trees, or that urban canopy, a healthy urban canopy can help remove pollutants. It was Frederick Law Olmsted have called trees the lungs of the city because they help remove pollutants from the air and can make urban areas much healthier. They can actually make makes business districts more successful. They can improve public health, not just from the pollutants, but as well as improved public health because it actually reduces stress. And there's a lot of key indicators that's looking at overall just cardiovascular health. It can improve the health with regards to heart disease, etc. So there's way more benefits to a healthy urban canopy that we're learning about, as well as reduce the heat island effect within those urban areas, and water pollution reduction. So those are some of the benefits of having a healthy urban canopy, which starts with, how are we pruning our trees and shrubs and make sure that we're maintaining that healthy canopy. Nonetheless, I think it's important for us to talk about this within the context of the statewide FloorFriendly landscaping program, which is just an integrative approach to sustainable landscape management to help protect and conserve water. It's more friendly to wildlife, it's environmentally responsible, and can be significantly less work than a traditional landscape. But when we think about pruning, with there's 9 principles of the FloorFriendly landscaping program. And that first principle is right plant, right place. There's a lot of times when the wrong trees or shrubs are selected for specific environments or locations within a community, around a home, etc., that leads to excessive pruning. We talked about reducing the size of plants, that pruning can help do that, but to a certain extent, trees and shrubs do not like being forced to certain sizes, which can lead to the overall decline in the health of those plants within the landscape. So a great example, when we talk about Crape Myrtle, so over pruning of Crape Myrtles, the best method is just to select a cultivar or a variety of those Crape Myrtles that are actually going to fit better within the space that you want to grow. Because if we have to over prune them, that's going to lead to their decline, and they're going to end up failing, getting more susceptible to disease or other pathogens, insect damage. Another situation, I always joke that it's called my landscaping pet peeve, and that's a sweet viburnum in front of a window of a house, because those are actually large shrubs that can get up to 20 feet tall. So they're constantly and excessively pruned in order to keep them at a size that is more appropriate for security around a home. But because of that over pruning of that shrub, that leads to consistent stress on it. So that brings in pest and disease damage, or can attract it. And then lastly, in that situation, right plant, right place. What's the size of that space? Why not select shrubs that work better in that space that you have available for them to fit in, to help reduce the amount of unnecessary pruning in order to help maintain plants at certain sizes. So that's why it's important to think about right plant, right place, not necessarily environmental conditions, but the size that they're going to get, so we can make sure that we're not having to do consistent or constant pruning that is unnecessary to the plant, because the over pruning will be detrimental to it. So now let's just jump into that pruning. So we'll talk about it and how do we prepare to prune? And then we're going to talk about, we're going to break it down into trees and then shrubs. So preparing to prune, it's always just planning. We think about planning, what's the tools and equipment, and then most importantly is sanitation. Sanitation is sometimes skipped on, but it's very, very important. So planning, don't prune to prune. Don't just go out and say, I need to prune my shrubs. Why are you pruning? The ultimate reason that we are pruning plants, the trees and shrubs in our landscape, is to help keep it healthy, help keep it strong. We can help keep the plant uniform, but it's also really important to think that we need to keep the pruning minor. We'll talk a little bit about it further on, but usually you don't want to do more than 25% removal of the plant. There are some situations you can do more, but you never want to do more than 25%. So minor pruning is best. So think about pruning, how it works within your landscape management calendar or schedule. Do you do it? Are you hiring arborists to do it for you? So it's important to make sure that you're thinking about how that pruning works. So let's talk about tools and equipment. A lot of you are obviously very familiar about the tools, but making sure that you are selecting the appropriate tools for the project that you're doing. So, pruning shears, or loppers, a pole saw, a ladder, a chainsaw. So choosing the proper equipment is going to be essential to making sure that you're doing the proper pruning practices. I get by with just pruning shears, loppers, and a handsaw, and I could do all the pruning and maintenance in my landscape. But the tools is one part of that equipment, or that It's one part of that formula. The next one is going to be the PPE, or the personal protection equipment. At the very beginning of the slide of the program, actually, let me go back. I laugh at this picture because this is a picture that we get from UF. What's the major wrong things that's happening in this presentation, in this image? So if you look at it, he has no safety glasses on. He's not wearing any gloves. So there's a whole lot of, a branch could fall on his head. So he needs to think about a helmet. So, and then also, more than likely, he's just pruning out this, oh no, the mistletoe that's within this oak tree right here. But that's still, you have to have the appropriate PPE or safety equipment, because, you can have anything hurt you while you are doing any type of pruning of your trees or in shrubs. Earlier this month, we talked about pruning roses, and we talked about the need of making sure you have long gauntlets, because you get pricked by all those prickles along the roses. So really think about those personal protection equipment. Steel-toed boots, gloves, safety glasses, long sleeve shirts and pants, and chaps and hearing protection if needed. That's the biggest one for chainsaws. One of the things that really scares me the most is anytime I see anyone using a chainsaw without chaps on. So because pruning trees and your shrubs is unbelievably dangerous, and making sure that you're doing it appropriately and safety is going to be key within your landscape. Next, talking about sanitation. So sanitation, one of the major ways that we spread diseases around our landscapes is through our equipment. Your lawnmower, you can spread fungal pathogens all throughout your turf grass just from mowing your grass. Your pruning shears, you can easily carry a pathogen from one plant to another because that pathogen ends up on those blades. So sanitation is of utmost importance. Since I've been in Nassau County, I have seen multiple instances where we actually have homeowners have disease all around their landscape, and it's purely because they didn't sanitize their equipment appropriately. So it can prevent the spread of plant pathogens. Usually if I'm pruning, I work on the sick plants first and sanitize, or I'll work on them last. And I make sure I'm sanitizing. There's a couple ways that you can sanitize, like isopropyl alcohol. You can soak your equipment in that. A bleach water solution, that's what I actually prefer the most, but the only issue is it can be corrosive to the metal, so you could end up getting dull blades. So making sure that you maintain your equipment is going to be important. Household cleaners, some people will still use that, like your Lysol wipes, etc., but there's not necessarily enough data to suggest that it's appropriate or how well they do on plant pathogens. But nonetheless, I know people that use it, and if it's all you have, it's worth trying it. So make sure you're sanitizing your equipment so you're not spreading any disease from plant to plant throughout your yard. So those are just the important things. So we're talking about planning. Why are you pruning? Thinking about the equipment and sanitation. So now let's talk about pruning trees. So pruning trees, we could break it up into cycle and dose. So when are you doing the pruning, and then how much of it that you're doing? So usually the minimum pruning cycle for trees is you're going to be planting, you're going to be doing some structural pruning right at planting. This to kind of help make sure it starts off with a little bit of that form, make sure there's the disease crossing branches, etc., are removed from the plant. And then you're going to come back at year 2 or 3 to do your next pruning cycle. Then year 5 or 6, or somewhere between 8 and 10, and then 13 to 15. And what that's going to do is during that early development of the tree, what you're going to start doing is setting up that healthy structure of the tree. And you're going to start forming those permanent branches for that mature tree around the 8 to 10 years. So you're trying to set up that healthy growth habit and form of the tree. So that regular pruning in that early first 15 years of that planting is going to be important for that structure of the tree. But then, dose. So we talked about cycle, but the dose is, you don't really want to go more than 25% or 20%. So usually we'll see the minimal dosage, or that low dosage, is going to be on those mature, more recently planted trees. We're going to see that in cooler climates that have short growing season, and then decay prone species. So like a red maple is actually considered a decay prone species. So if you go in and you prune that tree all over the place, then any excessive pruning that could end up leading to higher rates of decay on that tree, which make it more susceptible to pests and disease. And then also I like to think about, as part of that dose, what are we removing? So I like this table talking about consequence of removal. So anything less than a third of the trunk diameter, it's not going to have much removal, but the larger the branches, the trees get based off of the trunk of the diameter, the higher risk you are at causing some type of defects or some type of defect within the tree. So that dose, thinking about that low dose, minimum removal. And if you do it based off of that cycle, then each time you come in and do some type of pruning of the tree, it is minimal that you need to do, because anything higher than that can be higher risk of trees. I do know that in some situations, like a municipality or a government is in charge of pruning a bunch of trees, they may end up doing the higher prune dosage on some of those trees that don't have the high aesthetic value that might be somewhere else. So they need to do higher pruning because they may not be able to come back later on because of the amount of time and the trees that they have within their purview to manage. So, but for homeowners, we're going to be sticking within that 5 to 20% for the dosage. So planning the cuts, it's important to think about how do we plan the cuts. There's these, we call them the components, these components of these cuts of trees that we're going to do. And we're going to jump into a little bit more detail on some of these, but the develop or maintain a dominant leader is going to be an important part. So that is that main, essentially that main trunk that's running up through the tree. And then how you're going to identify the lowest branches in the permanent canopy. Prevent branches below the permanent canopy from growing too large. So it's going to be important that when we're talking about how big does a branch get, you never want to have any type of branch that is larger than the trunk of the tree or the diameter of that dominant leader. Keep all branches less than half the trunk diameter. Space main branches along one dominant trunk leader, so we'll dump into more details, and then suppress growth on branches with included bark. And included bark we see a lot in the landscape. And I do like this image on the right because you can kind of see that there is the newly planted tree. And one thing that we have with these newly planted trees is none of that branching is going to be the permanent branching. They're all temporary because as that tree ages and grows, we're going to end up removing majority of those branches eventually, but still important to think about how do we promoting healthy growth of that tree. And around that 5 to 10 year mark, we still have temporary branches that are occurring within the canopy, but it's not until that 5 to 10 year mark where we start developing that permanent canopy that's going to end up being what becomes these, what we call scaffolding branches, or these lower branches of the actual tree within the landscape. So continuing on, structural pruning, or at least a lot of our shade trees, is structural pruning to help maintain that overall health of the tree. Is important for young and mature shade trees. And improperly pruned trees are unsightly and can be unbelievably hazardous with breakage. And then if there is heavy breakage on some of the trees, that can lead to the ultimate decline of that tree, which can then end up leading to its failure much sooner rather than later. So shade trees and structural pruning is important for its overall health. So for that good tree structure, maintain that single dominant leader. And you can see that in this image right here. You see that strong dominant leader that runs straight up through the tree. That's going to help create that stronger structure of the tree. And then those lateral branches or the scaffolding branches, you can see in this image, you want to have them equally spaced about the trunk. So when you're thinking about that first pruning cuts, I always think about how do you remove or reduce branches that compete with the central trunk. So so we have that dominant trunk, and then what we do is we do what we call as reduction cuts. So those are removing any of the dominant branches or any branches that might end up competing with that dominant. And usually it's just some thinning that can be done, or reduction cuts. And you can actually see, no, we don't have snow here, but it's easy to see those structural cuts on dormant trees. So how do we do those different types, or what are those different types of cuts? There's a reduction cut and a removal cut. Reduction cut is it shortens the length of a stem by pruning it back to a smaller limb. And that's kind of what we're seeing in this image here. Is it's not doing some major branch removal, but it's doing those reductions where it's removing some of those stems and pruning back to smaller limbs. But then we do have removal cuts where we're pruning back all the way to the trunk or the parent branch. And you can actually see it a little bit in these diagrams, but those reduction cuts are usually help with maintaining structure, eliminate competition between branching, and then the removal cuts are those pretty extensive cuts where we're cutting off major branches of the trees. But this is one of the things that we need to make sure that we are watchful for. There's included bark. We need to make sure that we prevent or suppress included bark within our trees. And usually that's where you're going to have two branches. You have your dominant trunk, and you may have another branch that's of equal, approximately equal size. But what ends up happening at these spots, because of, you can see, especially in this image on the left, that crotch that is formed, it's a tight angle, and that actually increases the risk of breakage on that tree at that location. So when you're doing structural pruning, it's thinking about how do we eliminate and reduce those cuts to help give that dominant leader that runs up through the tree the structural integrity. And you can see on this image, it's hard to see on this image on the right, but this is a live oak, and this was breakage that has incurred at that included bark. So a major branch failure. So we can actually see in these images on this screen, some poor form and some nicer, stronger, better form of a tree. So looking at the left, you can actually see in both of these images, these areas where you have these included bark. You can start to really see it because you see this like strong kind of line that forms where these branches kind of meet. And you can see it right here in this image. That's at high risk of breakage in that location. So really thinking about making sure that we're reducing those. And then this better form we have, you can see it's a single dominant leader that goes all the way up through the tree, and there's not that included bark that's occurring within it. So usually it's important, it's easy to maintain these early on or to remove them early on. The further that you get in that tree's maturity and the more severe or larger those branches come, the higher risk of damage associated with limb breakage can occur. So it's best to stay active or proactive in that pruning to help reduce the likelihood that included bark actually begins because it's just a weak union at that included bark that's just high. It's very prone to breakage. Garner, do you all, I mean, this is, when you're talking about included bark, is this something that we're seeing common throughout the county from your perspective that we have seen as a high risk with some of the trees that we have to manage?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the mature trees on people's properties definitely have this included bark, because people are really only recently, relatively, really trying to pay attention to pruning practices. 100 years ago, it's not something that people really thought about. And, most of our mature live oaks on the island were planted well beyond that, So yeah, it's definitely something that you want to catch early on, like you said, because it can get costly and cause more of a significant impact to the trees themselves if you try to wait and do it later on.
Yeah, because I think, we have a lot of trees throughout wide diversity of trees throughout the county, and some have a higher wind resistance than others and do well, especially during our major storms like hurricanes coming, etc. But a tree like a live oak has really high wind resistance. It's wonderful, but the minute you have those areas of included bark, that's a weak point in that tree. So all of a sudden that tree has a higher risk of breakage in that location. So despite it having a high wind resistance, that point on that tree has a very low structural integrity. So therefore it's a higher risk tree, especially if it were to fall, where was it going to fall? And then if it's a high quality tree, if you have severe breakage on a tree, that could potentially have a significant impact on the overall quality of that tree within the landscape as well. Depending on how large the breakage, it could end up leading to complete loss of that tree over time. Sometimes trees have the ability to kind of withstand it, but not always. Thank you. So, like looking at this picture, which one from your perspective is stronger? You can put that in the chat box, the left or right image. All right, you all got it. So the right image, that is the strongest tree. From looking at it, just looks like a live oak. I'm not entirely sure, but you can see there's this dominant leader, and all of these branches, these scaffolding branches are coming off. None of them are included. They're coming off at like these healthy angles of the tree, which is really, really nice. And here, this is, I'm not exactly sure which one it is in this image. I want to say a Bradford pear just because they have similar structure to them, but this a bunch of included bark here. Here's one, it looks like included bark, and there's some over here. So this is a very high risk tree because of all these scaffolding branches all kind of emanating from one spot. So the right image is the healthiest one of these two. So good job. So now talking a little bit about those wounds that you create. So tree may be injured by improper pruning, mowers, string trimmers, storms, animals, temperature extremes, disease, chemicals. There's so many ways that we can end up damaging our trees. So really thinking about if we're going to prune them, doing it properly, because trees don't heal. Really, they kind of just grow over that wound and enclose it up, but it doesn't heal like you and I would heal if we would get a cut or something like that. So we need to make sure that any type of pruning cut that we do is going to be healthy for the overall tree because of all the other stresses that we unintentionally give to trees. So the trees, we create the cut, it doesn't heal, but it just kind of grows over and creates those boundaries over that wound that we've created. So when we're thinking about removing larger branches, there's always what we call like the 3-cut method. So the 3-cut method, what it does is it helps us essentially removing the weight of the branch, because if we before you do the final cut, because if we were just going to go up on a large branch and you just saw that branch, what can end up happening is that branch can fall away from the trunk and it's going to expose the trunk of the tree, which then makes that tree, it's not a clean wound. It makes that tree more susceptible for pathogens in order to get inside the tree, etc. So what we need to do is we do this 3-cut method, because what it does is it allows us to kind of create a controlled breakage of the limb to remove the weight of the branch so it doesn't peel away from the trunk. So we do this 3-cut method in such a way where we first do what we call the undercut. So the undercut becomes that break point. So you're kind of creating a perforated point on that tree. So once the branch falls or breaks, that's where it's going to break at. And it's not going to break down at the trunk or peel anything away from the trunk. So you start off with this undercut. It's really annoying trying to get an undercut with the pole saw, but you could still do it because you feel like it's really awkward a little bit. But nonetheless, you start off with that first cut, and then you come down with the top cut. That top cut, the second part of this cut, that's when you're actually going to cut down, cut through the branch until the branch falls and breaks. And as that branch falls, that weight is going to open up from this point, and then the tree is going to, the branch is ultimately going to break here and fall at this point, helping preserve this part of the tree, specifically this collar. That collar is what we need to protect. So then once we do that undercut and then that second cut on the top side, then we can come in and do that final cut where we remove that last little part of the branch that has no weight on it, or a lot less weight, to help preserve that collar. So it's important that we cut along with the collar, not with the trunk. So you can easily cut parallel with the trunk, but you're going to actually break into this collar, which we want to help protect because it can unintentionally expose the inside of the tree. Let me clear that. So we do our undercut first, come up and do the second cut. That removes the branch, the heavy part of the branch, and then you can do that final cut along the collar of the tree. So it's really important to think about that collar cut. That collar cut is that last cut because that is going to help with that enclosing portion. So you create the cut. This is where it's going to start growing over that wound. And so we need to make sure that we preserve that collar. So usually you can look for that bark ridge that you see here, and there's going to be that you can see here. And then sometimes there's going to be this branch collar is going to be swollen out a little bit, and you can actually see a very clear spot where the branch grows out of that collar. So you just cut along that spot. So you can't always see it as well too well in the tree. So when you do not see that there's no collar visible, usually you can look at it and say, okay, here's kind of like this ridge line that is created. That's that green line where the branch is kind of forming off of the trunk. And then you kind of draw a parallel line. Think of the parallel line with the trunk, and that's that red line. And you can, it says measure the two distances, but I usually just make sure I rotate a little bit further out to make sure that I'm clearing where that the collar actually is. So sometimes you have to eyeball it, but as long as you're trying to steer clear of where that collar is, you can have a cleaner cut to help with that tree mitigate that wound or manage that wound. So we need to protect that collar on any type of cut that we do on our trees. So here's some examples that you can see where that collar has been left intact. So this looks like a Chinese or Drake elm in this image on the top left, but here's kind of where that ridge line is. Here's the parallel trunk. So they kind of just moved that cut out from that collar a little bit, because you can't see it too terribly well. But you can see, you're going to see like that round concentric rings of your cut. That means you're safely within that branch. And you can see how the tree starts to grow over it, because that collar will start to grow and form over that and create that callus. And that's 1 year after the cut. So that's pretty significant for a tree to be able to heal itself, not heal itself, but to cover that damage that quickly.
Real quick, Taylor,
yes,
if you don't mind me jumping in, just if anybody had any, additional interest in learning more about that process, the process that trees use to seal their wounds, it's called CODIT, or compartmentalization of decay in trees. You folks, I can paste that in the chat box, and folks can look up more about that if they're interested. But Taylor's making great points with this process. If you take anything away from this whole presentation, this would be one of my biggest recommendations, is just making sure that you're keeping that branch collar intact. So
yeah, and I think maybe what we'll do is we'll create like a neat little video that can demonstrate that, because finding the collar isn't always straightforward, you know. So but that's a great point. So yeah, compartmentalization, that's the technical term. Thank you. That's great input. So let's talk about like what not to do. So overlifting of branches. So that's the removal of too many branches along the trunk. So and then also lion tailing. So lion tailing is a technical term where essentially you're overlifting and you're only having foliage at the tips or the ends of the branches on those trees. And that actually takes away some of the wind resiliency or that those trees has, because essentially branching and leaves, you know, you don't want so many leaves where it ends up being like a sail, but nonetheless, the leaves on a healthy tree act as a what we call a dampening effect. So as the tree sways one direction, the leaves might be rebounding another direction, and it can help keep that tree kind of reduce the amount of movement that it has during a storm. So lion's tailing is kind of what we call that, is where we're just putting the leaves and overlifting a tree and only having the leaves at the end of those branches, as well as just topping of trees or hat racking. That's just don't do that. It's not healthy for the tree. It's very, very stressful for the tree. There is technical strategies that you can do called pollarding, but we won't jump into the details of that one because that's very high maintenance. And I know that sometimes when we think about crepe myrtle, people are thinking of pollarding, but I've rarely seen a crepe myrtle being pollarded properly. So it's just highly stressful of trees. If we're having to do topping of a tree to reduce the size of a tree, then that's the wrong plant for the wrong place. And other things, you know, palms are really, really important. You know, they're an important part of our landscapes. When we talk about palms, you know, the best in some parts of the state, it's like you don't remove any palm fronds at all. They like that brown dead skirt that hangs down because of how important it is to wildlife. It really is unbelievably important, those fronds that hang down. But you know, only remove the dead fronds. Don't remove any green fronds. You know, we talk about what are called hurricane cuts. You've probably heard that. That actually goes the other way. It removes the resilience or the resistance those trees have to hurricanes and wind damage. So if you think about it, palm trees evolved in these, in some in Florida and other parts of the world that have these high wind events. And they never required hurricane pruning cuts before in the past. So if you're going to prune your palms at all, I always think of a T. You know, hold your hands out to the left and right, or think of a clock. Think of 3 and 9 o'clock. Never go anything, never remove anything above that. You remove anything above that 3 and 9 or that T, you're going to end up significantly damaging that tree, hurting that tree. So best rule of thumb, only remove dead fronds. You can remove dead or sometimes I know people will remove the flowers right when they set to fruit, because some palms, depending on where they're at, the fruit can be really, really messy, but it's also very valuable to wildlife. So for palms, there's no such thing as a hurricane cut. It hurts the tree. Think of the T. Never do anything above 3 and 9 o'clock. Never cut anything above that. So I think I'm flapping like a bird now in my office. That's what it looks like. So pruning palms, this is really easy. A pole saw, and you can do a lot of work with these when you need to cut them. So really easily. Here's a good image of kind of showing before pruning, acceptable pruning, over pruning. Ideally, you never remove anything unless it's dead. So we have a couple of things that popped up in the chat.
And Taylor, I got a question for you regarding prunes too.
Yeah.
I've done most of my arborist work in Utah, so we don't have palms there, obviously. But I'm, you know, been noticing, you know, a lot of newer transplants within the county being completely pruned, like all their foliage cut off. But I was doing some research and reading that that's to help with water retention. So during transplanting, it is okay to prune that foliage for certain palm species, like cabbage palm. Is that correct? Oh, I think you're muted.
There we go. Better now. Okay, so that's 100% correct. So when we see palms being transplanted or moved, you're going to see that pruning, and that is specifically with what Garner mentioned is moisture retention, to help them retain moisture during that transit. That's the only time it is acceptable. But when we're talking about landscape management, no, you never want to do that pruning. great point to bring up. And then you also put something in the Q&A or the chat box that's really important is sealants. Don't do them. You can go buy them. They don't help with any of the wounds. They can actually lead to further damage of the tree and decay because they hold in moisture and it can create rot on that wound. So don't use any paints or cover. Just cut the wound or create the wound through the prune and just let your trees be trees, and they'll manage it themselves. So saves us a little bit of money and time. So let's talk about pruning notes. I know, you know, with trees, we always have to be very careful with it. Pruning is very, very dangerous. It's unbelievably dangerous. Anything above your head can fall on your head. I've had injuries from just minor pruning where I've had just like a small branch fall on me. It's given me cuts. So it's really, really important to hire help for any of those big major cuts if you can't comfortably do it. Although tree climbing is a lot of fun for pruning, but hire help. The best way to do that is to make sure that you hire a ISA or International Society of Arboriculturists, a certified arborist. And you can find all the certified arborists or the companies that service our area that have arborists. You can go to treesaregood.org and then /find an arborist. That's a wonderful website because when you're selecting an arborist to do anything professional within your property, you need to make sure that they are licensed and insured. And you want to make sure that somebody is an arborist within that company that's making sure that you're giving good recommendations, because it's really easy to just hire someone to come in and do it. But if they're not licensed and insured, what can end up, and I've seen this happen before, albeit it's rare, but say there's an injury that happens on the property, that homeowner becomes liable because that individual may not be licensed or insured. And that's, you don't want that because pruning is very, very dangerous. So find an ISA certified arborist. If you do have a nice urban canopy that you want to maintain, it's really cool to find an arborist that you can work with to set up these regular pruning maintenance. It's not I want you to come in and remove my trees, but I want to work with you to make sure I have a healthy tree stand so I have a strong, mature urban canopy or canopy within my property. So they're just not removing trees, but helping maintain the trees that you do have and make sure that they're healthy and they have the certifications to do so. But it's also important, you know, yes, we can hire these certified arborists, but you know, it's also important to think about what do we need to do on the county side and maybe the city side, and what are those regulations and permitting that's important with any type of tree permitting. And that's a great thing. I have Garner and Thad here with Nassau County, because I wanted to give them a couple minutes to kind of talk about what that like Amelia Island Tree Protection Ordinance and what that means for Nassau County. So Garner, feel free to kind of jump in and kind of give that outline of what we're doing in Nassau County with regards to our tree ordinances and what's required for permitting, et cetera.
Could I do a little prelude?
Yeah, Thad, go ahead.
I'm a little butt in on you, Garner, but the background of the tree ordinance, a lot of you might know that we've had tree preservation in effect for some years now, but we made a major change in the tree ordinance, which Garner will tell you about. And essentially the biggest change is it now applies to pretty much across the board with a few exceptions. Tree protection is required. So this is a big shift for the county, and it's taken a lot of commitment and courage on behalf of the elected officials and the tree committee, which for gosh sakes worked for about 5 years on this new tree ordinance. So we're testing it out. I think there probably will be room for improvement, and Garner will be able to tell you a lot about it, but essentially it's kind of a compromise between development interests and environmental concerns. So instead of just blindly protecting trees, now we are essentially looking to reforest sites as well as preserve trees both at the same time. So that's kind of requires a careful balance, and we'll see how it works out. And Garner, take it away.
So like Thad said, you know, this is a relatively new ordinance. We've had a tree ordinance in the county for several years, but this one just went into effect about 2 weeks ago on February 7th. The biggest change from the old one to the new one is that this one now extends to all of the land on the unincorporated portion of Amelia Island, which includes single-family homes, duplexes, mobile home lots. So anybody that owns property on the unincorporated portion of Amelia Island. And I do want to emphasize that this does not extend to off island. So the rest of Nassau County, this does not impact at this time. And then, like that said, the mitigation requirements have changed. Beforehand, it was just 45% mitigation across the board. So you had to retain 45% of the diameter at breast height, the inches of trees on the property that were there from before development started. Now it is 25% mitigation for trees within the construction zone and 100% preservation of the rest of the trees on the property. So meaning any trees that you remove to build your home, you have to mitigate or replace for 25% of the inches that you removed. Now it does give developers some additional options other than just replanting. You can pay into a tree fund that we've created, and that is based on the cost to plant a 3-inch caliper live oak. And you can do that up to 50% of the inches that you're required to replace. And then there are some other strategies such as receiving preservation credits for retaining mature trees within your development site. So we will give you, like I said, preservation credits, basically reducing the overall mitigation requirement since you did retain larger trees, because those larger trees, provide the county with added benefits. We'd rather you retain a few mature trees than multiple little ones. The processes for this new ordinance is that you will need to apply for a tree removal permit before you remove any protected tree on the island. A protected tree is considered any tree species that is 5 inches or bigger in diameter at breast height, and that is healthy and not invasive. So really pretty much just about every tree. And then there are higher protection designations awarded to specimen trees, which are live oaks that are 40 inches in diameter or larger, or multi-stemmed live oak trees that are 60 inches in diameter or larger. There are exemptions to this process, such as if your tree is diseased, has experienced hurricane damage, or if it's causing any kind of hazard to your property or your person, you are exempt from the permitting requirement, but you do still need to get an ISA certified arborist to come out there and verify that those trees are in that condition. And you would need to receive a report from that arborist. And I would prefer that anybody that gets one of those reports to send it in to me, just that way I can just be in the loop and aware of what's going on. It's just helpful for when folks call in about trees being removed, I can address their concerns and let them know that, hey, it was diseased, and it was having these issues. If you do decide that you would like to remove a tree, to apply for a permit, you would get an application from the Nassau County Planning Department, and I'll put our contact information in the chat box, and Taylor will be sending out a follow-up email after this presentation with that information as well. But you simply call in and ask us for that application, fill it out, submit it back to me, and then I will review it. And then based on the criteria, and the specific circumstances of your situation, we will either approve or deny that, or work out some type of approval with conditions. I'll make sure to give my information to Taylor as well, so that way if you have any direct questions, I don't want to take up too much time in his presentation, you can shoot me an email or give me a call, and I can answer questions more specific to your circumstances.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. There was one question that popped up: is why is the county why is the ordinance currently limited to Amelia Island, and why not the rest of the county? I don't know the answer to that, so Thad.
Yeah.
As soon as you could answer.
The hard questions here. Yeah. I'll just be very frank about it. I mean, the Nassau County, particularly Western Nassau County, is very much has a rural character and property rights, emphasis on property rights, and I guess not really being super fond of regulations in general, which is kind of a whole different mindset from the island. You really have kind of 3 counties. You guys know, been here a long time, the island, and then Yulee, which is kind of rapidly developed, suburbanizing, and then the Western County. So, we here, the policymakers are sensitive to the citizens, and I think Yulee is kind of in that in-between area where people are starting to talk about preserving trees, and the county does have a pretty strong tree planting program in its development requirements for buffers and open space preservation. So it's in place, but Tree preservation, we're not quite there yet. We'll see where it goes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. There's a couple questions that popped up that did help answer. Oh, Thad, do you have something?
Nope.
And then we'll jump into the pruning.
I did.
Sorry,
have one more
Garner.
thing. Like Thad said, there's two things I wanted to add in addition to that. Other than just the permitting requirements and whatnot, the tree ordinance does establish a Nassau County Amelia Island Tree Commission. So we are in the process of forming that commission, but this commission will be responsible for overseeing a lot of tree-related decisions in the county. And one of the things that they're tasked with is implementing a tree planting program. Thad mentioned at the beginning of this that a big part of this new ordinance is reforestation rather than just preservation. So that is something that we are really excited about implementing. Like I said, we don't have the details yet, but moving forward, we'll get that program going. And yeah, just want to add that in there.
Yeah, and I'll jump in one more time, which is something I didn't mention, is the county owns quite a bit of land in terms of office facilities, parks, other county facilities. And, we have an opportunity to lead by example, and, we don't have anything in place, but it's certainly, we're interested in partnering with Dr. Clem and anyone else who wants to work together, keep Nassau beautiful on improving county facilities and parks. And I think that with the increasing heat island effects, our parks have to be kind of places of refuge and shade. So we will actively work with our recreation director on kind of planning for that kind of future for the parks.
Perfect. Thank you. There was a couple questions that popped up, had to do with timing of pruning trees and shrubs. We're about to jump into shrubs real quick, but usually the best time to prune is in the winter. All of our deciduous trees, the best time to prune them is during that dormancy period when they drop all their leaves, because that allows them, as they come out of that dormancy, allows that recovery to happen pretty quickly and with that new flush of growth. So it's kind of like nutrient management, where they're sending nutrients, et cetera. So it allows, so the timing of deciduous trees, in the winter when they're dormant. Evergreen trees can be pruned pretty much all year round. I think still, if you could prune them in the winter is going to be best, but still, I think it's important. But, how does that relate to our frost and freeze damage? Because we have a lot of freeze damage that happened from our hard freeze that happened the other week. And I see it throughout the county. So, trees or shrubs, the best thing to do is to not prune them if they have freeze or frost damage. Don't touch them. Wait. Wait until the end of that last frost, because much of the plants will actually recover themselves, and you won't have, some of it will be permanent damage and be dead. Others will just, it looks nasty right now, but it'll come out healthy. But we want to wait until our end of our last frost, or our concern of last frost is actually usually March 15th on average. We may get one more frost, but if we prune that frost or freeze damage now, it could encourage new growth to occur where you make those cuts on some of those shrubs. And then that new growth is very susceptible to that freeze or frost damage. So we usually want to wait until after that last freeze frost period or concern, usually mid-March, before we do any type of pruning back any dead or anything like that from freeze damage. So that question popped up, so I wanted to make sure that we cover it. So now let's quickly jump through shrubs. The shrub section is actually pretty short, but when do we prune shrubs? Evergreen shrubs, any time of year you can prune them. You can do light shaping or grooming of your shrubs at any time of year. Pruning shears can go a long way when making these little thinning cuts. So it's important, though, that if we're thinking about preserving flowers, though, and blooming, protecting blooming, we have some plants that actually form their flowers on the previous year's growth. And a great example is azaleas and camellias. Those are common landscape plants. So the best time to prune any of those plants is right after they get done flowering or blooming. So for azaleas, they're starting to bloom right now, which is, welcome the spring. But as soon as they're done, they start forming. As soon as they are done blooming, it's important to think about that's when you do your pruning for that next year, because they start forming the blooms for their next year's flowers in July. So our rule of thumb is do not prune any azaleas after Independence Day. So July 4th, no touching your azaleas. So make sure you're doing it immediately after flowering, both for the azaleas and your camellias. India hawthorns, if you have those in your landscapes. So shrubs that flower on new growth, you can, anytime before spring flush is an appropriate time to prune them. So it's important to think about the proper cut angles when you're going in to do pruning. Usually the best is, you can see on this image on the left, we have a 45-degree angle cut, and it's a little bit above a bud, and the angle angles away from the bud. So any moisture that ends up landing on that twig or branch actually just kind of flows off away from the bud, so it doesn't get water hanging on that bud, which could lead to rot or decay. So 45-degree angle is going to be the best cut on any type of prune that we are doing with our smaller stems or our shrubs within our landscapes. So when we're thinking about pruning shrubs, usually it's just a basic thinning. Because when you do a little bit of thinning cut, that can help improve and reinvigorate the plant, but you obviously can't reduce too terribly much. So remove all branches back to a lateral branch. Or back to the ground. In some situations, you can thin canes. So it's best done to do that like now. Any of your shrubs, except if it's blooming, obviously, you can do that thinning now. Like if you have roses, the best time to prune your roses was yesterday, but the best time to prune a lot of your plants is right now, before it starts shooting out its new growth for the season. And that's for those thinning cuts. We also have heading cuts, which is actually really significantly reducing that crown and reducing that overall size of the shrub. So you cut back branches to a lateral branch or a bud inside that canopy. Usually we recommend you want the buds on those shrubs facing outwards, because that's going to be the direction of that growth, because you don't want branches growing through the middle of the shrub, because they're going to be unproductive and they're going to waste a lot of energy of that plant. So cut each branch separately to different lengths. So then that means you have a much fuller and denser, because if you consolidate everything at the outside edge, you're just going to have plants on the outside edge and you're just going to have a hollow plant on the inside. So cut to where you want the foliage to fill in. So you see over time where people use pruning shears and they're just shaping a shrub to look a certain shape. The next thing you know, you just have twigs and branches at the end, because there's no interior growth that has occurred in the maintaining of that shrub. So then that shrub ends up kind of fizzling out over time. So those heading cuts, and trying to make sure you have varying heights or lengths so you can help fill in the density of that shrub, can be significant. So there's different ways that we can look at how we're pruning. Looking at our shrub hedges, there's the informal. So that's kind of like thinking about, what's that mature size of the plant? You kind of just want it to grow and be happy, and it sits there. So usually you're just making 6 to 18-inch heading cuts into the canopy, nothing significant, still maintaining that overall mass and size. Never do anything like you see in that bottom image where it's significant heading cuts where you're just cutting it back to twigs, because that's going to be really unhealthy for the plant. So but when we do have situations where you want to have something a little bit more formal, it's important to think about what that shape is going to be of the shrub. Usually, we prune it. You see a lot of times where it's almost open more up at the top versus the bottom. It's important to have it more open at the bottom, because that improves sunlight exposure to the lower branches. The minute that we start to prune it like this, the plant starts shading out its lower branches, and you can end up with that image that you see on the bottom right, is where you just lost a lot of that lower part of your canopy because of your tapering it off too much at the bottom. So it's better to actually have it more tapered out, flared out at the bottom, to expose more sunlight, to help make sure that you have that strong formal hedge. So if you have canes, so let's say Mahonia, Nandinas, if you have Nandinas, get rid of them. They're invasive. There are some sterile varieties, but they're hard to tell the difference between them, and also the berries are very toxic to birds and wildlife. So, but if you do have these cane forming shrubs like a Mahonia, What you're going to do is you're going to prune 1/3 of the tallest canes back to the ground each year, because that allows it to be a full shrub, where if you don't do that, then you're just going to have a cluster. I call it like a lollipop. So it looks like a cluster of leaves on the top of a bunch of sticks. And that's kind of like what you see in this image. So removing 1/3 of the tallest canes will end up helping fill in that entire shape and form of that shrub, and it's not going to be consolidated to one single spot. So grasses, I always, people ask me, why do we prune grasses? Well, a lot of our native grasses, like our Fakahatchee grass and our muley grasses, they've evolved in fire-prone areas. So they're used to having fires come in, and it kind of walks them back a little bit. But when we don't have fire to help manage that, these shrubs really benefit from the annual pruning or cutting back. So after that last frost, I know we're seeing it now throughout the landscape, even though I think it's still too early. But wait until right before that new flush is about to come out, and then cut those grasses back to about 12 inches. And it's going to come back fuller and healthier and stronger. Sometimes people do this every year. I don't recommend doing this some people do this every single year, which is good. You can do this every other year, but I wouldn't do it any further beyond that. So regular cutting by those ornamental grasses. I love the form that those grasses have in the winter, so I like keeping it there as long as possible. So then I cut right before the new growth comes, and then bam, my grasses come back in within a couple of weeks, and you never really saw that gap in between time when that grasses was cut. So, all right, so we went through those the shrubs really quick. Shrubs is really easy, just kind of thinning and pruning as needed. But the biggest thing is we spent a lot of time talking about trees, and that's kind of the biggest issue that we have in the landscape. I don't want to say issue, but one of the most common questions that we have throughout the year in the landscape. So we're coming back to those essential questions. What are the best management practices or recommendations for pruning trees and shrubs? You should feel a little bit more enlightened about that. We talked about planning, equipment, as well as sanitation, but then we talked about the different types of cuts, strong structure of trees, that permitting process through the county. And then we also talked about a little bit about the shrub pruning at the end, and then we also covered those, talked about the county code, the ordinances. And I do thank Garner and Thad for joining us as part of that discussion. But feel free to reach out to us at the County Extension Office. Our main office is in Callahan over at the fairgrounds. Our new office on Minor Road is going to be opening this year. So we'll end up moving out there, but we still have the Callahan office open nonetheless. But feel free to reach out to us. We have the Master Gardener Volunteer Help Desk. And then here's my contact information. So feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email if you have any questions or anything like that. And we'll go ahead and we'll open up, because I know we got a lot of questions that just popped in. So we can kind of cover some of these early on. So let's see. So some of the questions is, as there are so many varieties of hydrangea, is there a general rule as to when to prune? So yeah, hydrangeas, they're going to be a great flower. They are flowering on that new growth. So I'm going to be pruning them, my hydrangeas, usually at that beginning time and early part of the season. And it doesn't matter what kind of hydrangea it is, as long as it's within that genus, that pruning time is going to be the same. That's a very good question. So here's one that says they have a mulberry that's just a stick. What is the best way to prune it? So a lot of our fruit trees, and I didn't mention it, citrus trees, don't prune them unless you have to. Remove dead, sick, or diseased parts, or any branches that are crossing. Usually we don't need to prune them. So of course, we do have some mulberries that get massive, like our white mulberry. That's just a huge tree, and it has an amazing amount of fruit production. I love mulberries, but if you have one of the large shade tree mulberries in your landscape, you're going to maintain it like an ornamental, so structural pruning, and usually during that dormant period is going to be the dormancy period is going to be the best time to prune those. So is there a crepe myrtle that looks like a shrub? Yes. Yeah, crepe myrtles have been cultivated for, there's hundreds of different varieties, I think, that are available at different heights and sizes. And there are dwarf crepe myrtles that are available that maybe get 3 feet on a good day. you know, and they look wonderful in the landscape. They're prolific flowering, just like the rest of the other crepe myrtles. And I'll send it out just because we talked about it. We actually have a really cool publication that talks all about the different types or cultivars of crepe myrtles. And I think it's been updated with include some more, but includes the name, the height that they get, and the flower color. So the most common crepe myrtle that we see is the Natchez, and that's a red flowering crepe myrtle, but that sucker gets 25 feet tall. And that's the one we're seeing a lot of like that crepe myrtle on. But my goodness, if you let that Natchez grow, it's a beautiful, beautiful tree. So I'll send out that document. But yeah, there are some types of crepe myrtles that do stay nice and low. Should beauty bushes, like the beautyberry, should they be pruned? I do prune them periodically, not always. I will help them. They do, after the fruiting period, you can cut them back and it can be more prolific. You can do some of those thinning cuts to help make it form kind of like a stronger, more shrub looking, but it is still always kind of stays leggy. But if you do want to kind of keep it low, you can cut it back. It's not going to hurt it at all. So that's a great question about that beautyberry. Oh, what is the beautiful purple flower on one of my early slides? Great question. That is a vine. That is one of my favorites. That is a passion flower. So the passion flower vine, it's a native plant. There's one invasive, but I don't think we see it really. And I don't think I've seen it in Nassau County, but passion flower, beautiful. Pollinators love it. Give it a trellis. It loves full sun, part shade. Great. It's just a unique, cool flower. Yeah, so that was a passion flower. What are some berry bearing shrubs that are good to area attract birds? So, the berry bearing shrubs, I mean, we have a bunch. Hollies are always great native plants. Birds love them. Cardinals, robins. If we had more time, I would tell you my story about seeing 100 very fat, large, full-bellied robins because they were eating every berry off of some holly trees. But so hollies are really nice, but really when we're thinking about it, it's thinking about year-round fruit availability. And that's why I like hollies, because during a winter time, they're fruiting. So they can provide a really key, important food source to a lot of our wildlife. So I have some general questions about fruit trees. If your fruit trees are blooming, don't prune them. Just wait. Most of our fruit trees, just avoid pruning them unless they're diseased, sick, or dying. You will see pruning on citrus trees in groves and fields, and they do that just to kind of keep the fruit lower. It's easier to reach to them. That's the only reason that they really prune a lot of the fruit trees, to make it easier to reach. So, but there aren't really any two key distinction for pruning fruit trees. We can get into very, very specifics, but if we start to, like some apples do have a little bit extra recommendations. But if you're following these key basic cutting recommendations, take out the dead, dying, and decayed, that's going to be the best. Or any crossing branches, any branches that are rubbing against one another, remove one of them. So here's one. A bougainvillea got freeze damage. I cut freeze damage completely back. I would wait more than likely, because bougainvillea is more of a tropical plant. It doesn't grow in our zone 9A, so we kind of treat it as an annual perennial. More than likely, it might be all completely dead except for the rootstock, but it'll start growing back. So just keep an eye on it. Bougainvillea are very tricky plants in this part of the state because they just don't like cold at all. This one, thinking crepe myrtle might be a tree, but a bush that I inherited from. Thinking my crepe myrtle might be a tree, but left as a bush that I inherited from previous owner. Should I cut back? It's hard to tell. It just really depends on what it is, on what that plant is. I recommend not cutting anything back unless you plan on, or just remove it and replace it with something different. Proper ID is going to be best for management. So if you want to send me pictures of it, I can help with that ID so we can figure out what would be that next best step. Got a lot of great questions today. This is wonderful. Does the crepe myrtle decrease its flowering as it ages? No, it does not. Sometimes one of the reasons that people will do the crepe myrtle is because they think it makes it more prolific in its flowering, but actually what's doing is just keeping all the flowers more condensed. So when you have an older, more mature crepe myrtle, the canopy isn't as dense, so the flowering is just more spread out, but actually you might have way more blooms than a crepe myrtle tree. So usually we're going to start seeing that flowering decrease. It might be a sign of a nutrient deficiency, so you can always send soil off to do a nutrient test. We don't see it too terribly much because one of the nutrients that really targets bloom production, one of them is phosphorus, and phosphorus is really high and naturally occurring in our soil anyway. So it's actually very rare that we I lost my train of thought completely. A question popped up and it threw my mind. Oh, yes, it's really rare that we have to put down any phosphorus. So sorry, my mind went. Someone mentioned that they covered the robolinas with sheets and now the fronds are dying. So is covering them wrong? No, covering is a great way to protect our plants that don't like our freeze or frost. It's nice to have plants that might look tropical, but it's also important to think that we protect them. So covering our plants with blankets can be a great way to protect them. Do not cover plants in plastic sheets. That does not help. So if it's dying and you think it's related to covering them, it could be because the wrong material was used to cover that plant. And sometimes people will tie them up at the bottom to seal it off. That doesn't help. That can actually make it worse. So usually it's just draping like a sheet, an old sheet that you have for your bed over a plant. That's all you need to do. You can get specific frost cloths, but it needs to be breathable. If it's not breathable, that can make it worse. And I know sometimes to help, like if you have a citrus tree and it's blooming, that freeze will kill those blooms and then you won't get any fruit production. So you just drape that tree with a cloth or a sheet or whatever it might be, and then you can actually just put a light underneath it, like a halogen light or just something that you just plug in and put underneath there, because it actually creates a little bit of heat and it helps protect those blooms from that freeze and frost. So then you can help protect and preserve those blooms so you actually get fruit production. If we're having low chill hour fruits in our landscapes, then that's always a concern, is you have early bloom onset and then bam, frost kills all those blooms. So choice material is so important to making sure when we're covering it, but it's a great handy tool if we have those tropical plants that don't like those freezes. So great question, man. I just whirled through those. But anyways, so that's all we have for today. I'll still stay online for a couple of the questions. And I do have a follow-up survey. Oops, I'll include that in the email that I send out to everybody. And what we use is that in that follow-up survey, we do that as a way to monitor how we're doing on our programs, how to adjust, make things that we, anything that we are, make sure that we're not missing anything, etc. So helps us improve those overall programs. And then we use that as reporting to the state, since the IFAS extension is, it's a partnership between the university and the county. So, you know, we work for the county and we also work for the state as part of the university, but we use these numbers to help show the value that our programs have, and allows us to make sure that we're having the most robust program. So we actually benefit greatly from that. So I'll send that out to everybody. We are having some upcoming programs. We did have one question about, do we have any more Zoom classes coming? I'll send everybody out the sign up list, the registration link for upcoming programs next month about the birds. With the Landscape Matters program, it's happening the 2nd and 4th Wednesday of every month throughout the entire year, from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Currently, we're going to keep them online, but traditionally we'll do them at like the Yulee Annex office, which is over on Pages Dairy Road, but we're going to keep them online because for right now. But I'll send everybody out a registration link so you can tune in to our next classes that we do have. But go ahead and earmark that 2nd and 4th Wednesday of every month, and you should be able to get those announcements and be able to register for those programs. So great question.
And then mind if I
Oh yeah, go
I
ahead.
throw in one little plug real quick. I just want to let everybody know that's still online that Keep Nassau Beautiful is doing some tree planting or free tree giveaway, tree drives. It's there's 3 Saturdays coming up. There's going to be one in Callahan, one in Yulee, and then one in Fernandina Beach. You can go on their website and go to their tree planting section, and you just watch a short video, and then sign up for the trees that you want, and then you just come there that day, and they'll put the 2 free trees that you can get. You can get up to 2 of them. They'll just put it right in your car, and they'll tell you how to plant it, and give you all the instructional material that you'll need.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tree selection they have is great. It includes Crape Myrtles, which is neat. But there's a bunch of other wonderful trees that you can get as part of that tree giveaway. So good plug, good plug. So, all right. Well, thank you all very much. I'll hang around for a few more minutes if you have any more questions, but I want to thank Garner and Thad for joining us today to help answer some of the questions that we had about the ordinance, because when we're talking about tree pruning, you know, there is permitting requirements that can exist. So we want to make sure that we're doing it appropriately. So thank you all for taking the time to help us out today. And thank you everybody for joining us. I appreciate it.